She found him at the edge of the canyon, a broken man against a broken landscape. He was battered, bloodied, and shattered in a way that went far deeper than his physical wounds. The wind whipped around them, carrying whispers from the nearby town, whispers that said he was beyond saving, a cowboy so hardened by loss that his heart had turned to stone. They said no one could reach him, that the darkness had claimed him for good. But she, the widow's daughter, saw something else. She saw a flicker of a soul worth fighting for. With a quiet strength that belied her gentle nature, she stepped into his world of shadows. She didn't have a grand plan or a magic cure.
All she had was a kind heart and a stubborn refusal to give up on him.
Day by day she tended to his injuries, her touch a stark contrast to the rough life he'd known. She brought him warm broth, clean bandages, and something he hadn't experienced in a long, long time: simple, unconditional compassion. She'd sit with him for hours, sometimes in silence, just letting him know he wasn't alone. The silence was a language they both understood. His was born of pain, hers of patience. The townsfolk watched from a distance, shaking their heads. They saw a foolhardy girl wasting her time on a lost cause. "He's a ghost," they'd mutter, haunted by the memory of the family he couldn't protect. They spoke of the fire, the tragedy that had stolen everything from him and left him wandering the wilderness, a man running from his own reflection. They didn't understand that her own heart was no stranger to loss. Having lost her father young, she knew what it was to see a shadow fall over a home, to live with an empty space at the table. She recognized the hollowness in his eyes because she had seen a version of it in her own mother recess. As the weeks turned into a month, the physical wounds began to heal. The cuts closed, the bruises faded, and he started to regain his strength. But the real transformation was happening on the inside, in a place no one could see. He started to watch her as she moved about the small cabin, her presence a quiet hum of life in his desolate world. He watched her mend his torn shirt with nimble fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her talk to her horse in the evenings, her voice soft and full of affection. These small moments were like drops of rain on parched earth, slowly, painstakingly seeping into the cracks of his hardened heart. He never spoke of his past, and she never asked. She gave him the space to heal at his own pace. Instead, she'd tell him stories about her life, about the wildflowers that grew in the meadow after the spring rain, about the hawk she'd seen circling high above the canyon. She filled his silence not with questions, but with life. And in doing so, she was unknowingly giving him a reason to want to live again, not just survive. She was showing him that a world still existed outside the walls of his grief. One evening, as she was adding a log to the fire, he spoke. His voice was raspy from disuse, but it was clear. "Why?" It was a single word, but it held the weight of 1,000 questions. "Why are you helping me? Why don't you listen to them? Why are you still here?" She turned, her face illuminated by the firelight, and a small smile touched her lips. "Because no one should have to face the dark alone," she said simply. It wasn't a grand declaration of love or a promise of forever. It was a simple truth offered without expectation. And in that moment something shifted within him. A wall he had spent years building began to crumble. He wasn't just a man recovering from his injuries anymore. He was a man learning to feel again. He started to help with chores around her small homestead. He fixed the fence that had been damaged in a storm, his hands, once used to the cold steel of a gun, now working to build and protect. He chopped wood, his movements sure and steady, a rhythm returning to his life. He even started to speak more, sharing small details about the land, things he'd learned in his solitary wanderings, where the deer came to drink at dawn, which clouds promised rain. He was slowly rejoining the world of the living. And she, in turn, found herself changing. His quiet presence filled a void she hadn't realized was there. She found herself looking for him in the mornings, a small smile playing on her lips when she saw him already up and about. His silent strength became a comfort, a steady anchor in her life. The whispers from the town began to fade into the background, replaced by the quiet reality of their shared existence. They were two lonely souls who had found a strange sort of peace in each other's company. Love, when it came, wasn't a sudden storm. It was more like the sunrise over the canyon, a slow, gentle light that chased away the long shadows of the night. It was in the way he'd place a wildflower on her windowsill. It was in the way she'd save him the last piece of cornbread. It was in the shared glances across the dinner table, glances that said more than words ever could. He was no longer the broken man from the canyon, and she was no longer just the widow's daughter.
They were two people who had found a home in each other.
But the past has a way of lingering. One day, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. A group of riders, men from his former life, men who believed justice was found at the end of a rope. They had come not for him, but for the town that had shunned them, believing it was harboring stolen gold. The peace he had so carefully built was about to be shattered. The town that had called him a lost cause was now in the path of a danger he knew all too well. He looked at her, at the life they had started to build, and he knew he couldn't run anymore.
The darkness he had fled from had followed him, but this time he wasn't alone. This time he had something to protect.
Not out of a thirst for vengeance, but out of a deep, abiding love. He wasn't the hardened man he used to be. The kindness she had shown him hadn't just healed his wounds. It had reforged him into something stronger. He rode out to meet them, not as the ghost of the canyon, but as the man she had saved. What happened next would become a local legend. It wasn't a story of a bloody shootout, but of a man who used his knowledge of the land and the wisdom he'd gained through his pain to outsmart his old enemies, protecting the very people who had once turned their backs on him. He wasn't fighting with hatred, but with a fierce determination to preserve the light she had brought into his life. He returned not as a hero seeking applause, but as a man coming home. When he saw her waiting for him, her face etched with worry that melted into relief, he knew he had finally found his redemption. It wasn't in avenging his past, but in building a future. The townsfolk never whispered about him again. Instead, they spoke of the cowboy who was saved by love and in turn saved them all. And so, the man she had nursed back to life repaid her compassion, not with gold or grand gestures, but with a promise. A promise of a shared future, of a life built on second chances, and of a love that was strong enough to heal the deepest of wounds. In the end, the quiet strength of a kind heart proved to be more powerful than any loss, any grief, or any darkness. It was a love story born at the edge of a canyon, a testament to the fact that sometimes saving one person is enough to save the world. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden haze over the sleepy town of Cedar Ridge, when Clara Matthews was tending to her small garden. As the daughter of the town's recently deceased and universally loved widow, Clara cherished these quiet mornings, the rich smell of the earth and the soft cooing of birds. But this morning, the peace was shattered. A faint groan, carried on the breeze from the canyon's edge, caught her ear. Curiosity mixed with instinct, Clara hurried toward the sound. There among the rocks and wildflowers lay a man. His clothes were torn, his body marked by a struggle. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, his face a mask of pain and exhaustion. Clara's heart clenched. She didn't recognize him. He wasn't from Cedar Ridge, yet something about his despair felt hauntingly familiar, as if life itself had betrayed him. "Sir, are you okay?" she called softly, kneeling beside him. He didn't respond, only let out another ragged groan. Without hesitation, Clara helped him sit up, gently dragging him to a spot of shade. She tore strips from her apron, fashioning a makeshift bandage for his bleeding arm. She murmured soothing words, unsure if he could even hear them. It took nearly an hour for him to speak. When he finally opened his eyes, they were fierce and stormy, yet so vulnerable it made her chest ache. Who are you?" he rasped. "I'm Clara," she replied, offering a timid smile. "I saw you were hurt. You need help," he flinched, as if the concept of kindness was foreign to him. I don't need anyone," he muttered, his voice a tangle of pain and pride. But Clara wasn't one to take no for an answer. "You can't stay here. It's too dangerous," she insisted. With gentle persistence, she helped him stand and guided him back toward the town. The journey was agonizingly slow. Every step tested his strength, but Clara never faltered. By the time they reached her small, modest home, the cowboy, whose name she learned was Luke, was leaning heavily on her, too weak to protest any further. Clara settled him by the hearth, tending to his wounds with meticulous care. As she worked, she noticed the subtle shifts in his demeanor. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased slightly, and the storm in his eyes began to soften. Little did Clara know, this was the beginning of a profound transformation. Luke had arrived in Cedar Ridge carrying a burden far heavier than his physical injuries. A lifetime of loss, guilt, and loneliness had hardened his heart into something he believed was unbreakable. But under Clara's gentle, unwavering care, the first cracks began to appear in the walls he had so carefully built around himself. With each passing day, as Clara cleaned his wounds and shared her simple meals, Luke found himself watching her. He saw the quiet strength in her eyes, the resilience forged by her own recent loss. He saw the kindness she extended not just to him but to everyone in Cedar Ridge, a town that still mourned her mother. He began to notice the small things, the way she hummed a tune while kneading dough, the determined set of her jaw when she repaired a broken fence post, the genuine warmth in her smile that could light up the dim corners of her cottage. His gratitude, at first a silent, grudging acknowledgement of her help, started to grow into something deeper, something warmer. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years, a flicker of hope, a sense of belonging. He started to speak more, sharing fragments of his past, not the dark secrets he kept locked away, but small stories of the open range, the stars over the prairie, the life he had known before it all went wrong. Clara, in turn, found a strange comfort in his presence. The house, so silent since her mother's passing, now held a new energy. His quiet strength was a grounding force. She saw past the gruff exterior to the wounded man beneath, a man who, like her, was navigating a world altered by grief. They were two lonely souls, thrown together by fate, finding solace in the unspoken understanding that passed between them. Their conversations became longer, filled with shared silences that were more comfortable than words. As Luke's body healed, so did his spirit. The fierce defensiveness in his eyes was replaced by a protective gaze whenever he looked at Clara. He started helping around the property, his strong hands mending what was broken, his presence a quiet promise of security. He was falling in love, a love born from the ashes of his former life, a love he intended to repay in ways she could never imagine. The people of Cedar Ridge were wary at first. Whispers followed the stranger who now lived in the widow's cottage. But they saw the change in Clara, a lightness in her step that hadn't been there for months. And they saw the way Luke looked at her with a reverence that silenced their doubts. That first night, as he had drifted to sleep wrapped in the warmth of her kindness, neither Clara nor Luke could have foreseen the journey ahead. It would be a path that would challenge their hearts, test their courage, and force Luke to confront the very past he had run from. But it was also a journey that would heal them both, weaving their broken pieces together to create something new, something whole, something built on the foundation of a stranger's rescue on a golden Cedar Ridge morning. Their story was just beginning, and it promised a love as vast and untamed as the western sky. Days turned into weeks, and Luke slowly began to regain strength under Clara's gentle, patient care. She tended to him with the same quiet dedication she gave her mother's garden. She cleaned his wounds, prepared his meals, and sat with him for hours on end. She'd share stories of the town, of her childhood, and of the dreams she held in her heart. Every word, every small act of kindness, felt like sunlight breaking through the clouds, warming Luke's weary soul. For the first time, he started to understand that compassion could be a force more powerful than any weapon he'd ever held. But the healing wasn't just physical. Luke's heart, which had been battered by loss and betrayal, had been sealed shut for years. He was haunted by guilt, by mistrust, by the ghosts of friends lost in battles he could never forget. Whenever Clara laughed, or when her hand gently touched his to guide him, he felt a flicker of emotions he thought were long dead: hope, warmth, even a sense of longing. He fought against them, resisted acknowledging their presence, terrified that opening his heart again would only lead to unbearable pain. One evening, as a soft rain tapped a gentle rhythm against the windows of Clara's modest home, the silence between them was finally broken. Luke's voice was hoarse, unsteady. I don't understand why you care so much. You barely know me. Most people would have left me to my fate. Clara looked at him, her eyes steady, filled with a quiet resolve that seemed to cut through his defenses. Because everyone deserves care, Luke, she said softly. Everyone deserves a chance to be whole again, even someone who's been hurt as deeply as you. Those words pierced through the armor he had spent years building around his heart. He felt a desperate urge to tell her everything, the truth about the battles he'd fought, the mistakes he'd made, the crushing emptiness he had carried for so long. But the words felt too fragile, too inadequate for the weight of his past. So instead, he did the only thing he could. He began to trust her. Slowly, hesitantly, he allowed himself to be vulnerable for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. They worked together around her small property, mending fences that had fallen into disrepair, planting new gardens filled with the promise of life, and sharing stories of lives both lost and hoped for. In those quiet moments, Clara saw glimpses of the man hidden behind the pain, a man who was loyal, gentle, and courageous. And Luke, in turn, realized that her presence had become the anchor he had been searching for, grounding him in ways he never knew were possible. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since he was a boy. But life, as it so often does, has a way of testing even the strongest of bonds. A harsh storm, a true tempest, descended upon Cedar Ridge. The wind howled like a cornered animal, and the rain came down in sheets, threatening to wash away everything in its path. Clara's home and her beloved garden were right in the storm's crosshairs. Without a second's hesitation, Luke sprang into action. He was a force of nature himself, repairing fences as they broke, clearing debris that threatened the house and physically shielding her from the worst of the wind and rain. For the first time in his life, he wasn't acting out of a sense of duty or a primal need for survival. He was acting out of love, a deep, profound love he hadn't even fully admitted to himself. After the storm passed, they stood together under a clearing sky, the air fresh and clean. The world seemed washed anew. Luke took Clara's hands in his. His were rough and calloused from a hard life, but his touch was unbelievably gentle. "Clara," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved me, not just my body, but my heart. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Clara smiled softly, her own eyes welling up with the first tears of relief and joy. "You've already repaid me, Luke," she whispered. "Just being here, being alive, that's all I could ever want." Luke's gaze held hers, unwavering and filled with a tenderness that spoke volumes. "No, I mean more than that. I love you, Clara. I think I always have, in ways I didn't understand until you healed me." In that moment, all the shadows of the past finally melted away. Luke and Clara stood together, not as a wounded cowboy and a caretaker, not as a scarred man and a widow's daughter, but as two hearts that had found their way to each other, mending one another through patience, courage, and unwavering compassion. The town of Cedar Ridge soon began to whisper of their love story, but those whispers mattered little to them. What mattered was the journey, the unexpected, fateful encounter that had brought two broken souls together and allowed them to heal, to hope, and to discover a profound truth. They learned that true love isn't just found. It's nurtured patiently, tenderly, and unconditionally. As the sun set over the canyon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Luke and Clara walked hand in hand, ready to face whatever life would throw at them, together. Because they had learned the most powerful truth of all: love can heal even the deepest wounds. And when hearts are truly open, it multiplies beyond measure. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next video.